Welcome, everyone, to NGW's In a Nutshell podcast, which takes stock of the most important developments shaping the global gas industry. I'm happy to be joined again by Thierry Bros, professor at Sciences Po Paris, and Anne-Sophie Corbeau, a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Today, we will once more be delving into the status of the European energy market. But before we get into that, we'll also be looking at the current energy crisis and the outlook in Asia and in other areas. So, Anne-Sophie, thank you for joining us once more. A lot of attention has been on the impact of the global energy crisis on Europe. But can you elaborate more on the impact on Asian markets in terms of the economy and the environment? And can you comment somewhat on the outlook?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of attention has been indeed given to Europe, but when you are looking at Asia, it's quite visible that Asian gas consumption has actually declined as well. And in particular, it has declined in China. I had to look back at the statistics to find a single year where when Chinese gas consumption actually declined, and I had to go back to the 80s, to the beginning of the 80s. So it has
Wow.
been 40 years since we saw Chinese gas consumption declining. And apparently, according to the first estimate, it has declined between anywhere between 1% and 1.7%. But for a market like China, which is one of the largest markets after the United States and Russia, this is quite a substantial decline. And there were
Mhm.
two reasons behind that decline. The first one is, of course, like everywhere else in China, the very high gas prices, spot prices, but also the fact that China was suffering from COVID-led restrictions. So the zero COVID policy impacted particularly industrial activity. And this is something that we have seen also in terms of economic activity in general in China. Looking at other countries in Asia, we have seen also a relatively steep decline in India, also because for them, spot LNG was clearly not affordable. Also in Japan, in Korea, and in particular in Southeast Asia. I would say that, for me, one of the most striking things was what happened in Bangladesh and Pakistan, where those two
Mhm.
countries could simply not afford to buy the very expensive spot LNG and had to resort to either have nothing, and do remember that there were some very important blackouts in Pakistan last year and also some very significant heat waves, or resorting to alternative fuels and in particular to oil products or coal. So this is
Mhm.
not particularly great for the environment, but this is a situation that we have seen in Asia. To conclude, I would like to add also that in general, we have seen gas consumption declining, in particular in the power sector in Asia. This is where usually gas is not particularly competitive against other technologies, and in particular, it was too expensive, especially for those countries who are depending on spot LNG supplies.
Mhm. And Thierry, staying with China, can you comment a bit on the kind of direction of its security of supply strategy and perhaps how it's been impacted by events over the last year? And what are the global implications of that?
Yes, I mean, perhaps one comment after Anne-Sophie. I think China is moving away from the zero COVID policy, and so therefore there will be a boost in gas demand. We are already seeing it a little bit, but I think what's very important if we were to relate this to Europe. I mean, remember in Europe we are talking about limiting people mobility, limiting. I mean, there are people talking about this, and what you see is even in China you can't do it. So I think we are very into our way of lives. We want to continue to travel, and so therefore we have to look in a world where people will continue to travel. Even the Communist Party in China had to lift its zero COVID policy. So that's the first element. The second element, I think, and this podcast is particularly well timed because as we speak, we have President Ursula von der Leyen from the Commission and President Macron from France meeting President Xi in China. And I think we have to stop being naive about China. China will need a lot of energy going forward and has a master plan in terms of security of supply. And the master plan is, I would say, twofold. One is what the French used to do back 20 years ago. And it's a very simple master plan. It's looked like, I would say, Winston Churchill was designing those for the UK back last century, which is about diversification of supply, which means I take Russian pipe gas and at the same time I build regas to be able to have more LNG going forward. But I think the master plan is a way more Machiavellic. I think we have to keep in mind that China doesn't have enough gas storage. So therefore, China has to look at its security of supply at the peak, not at the base load as we do in Europe, because we have the ability to fill our storage during summer. And so therefore, China is going to dimension its LNG and its gas purchase to meet the peak, because the Communist Party doesn't want to have the Chinese freezing in plain winter. And this means that China will be long in summer. And we've seen this back a few years ago. I mean, the Communist Party states that you can trade gas, retrade gas, resell LNG in summer, not in winter. And I think this is going to put further stress on the Europeans because we do not have such a master plan. We may end up being short in gas all year long, and China may be in a position to resell us its gas in summer at a spread, at a positive spread, which means that at the end of the process, we will have to pay our energy higher than the Chinese. Remember, back 20, 30 years ago, there was what was called Asian premium in oil. It disappeared. I think the Chinese are trying to address the way they are addressing their long-term supply to make sure that there will be a European premium in LNG. And if we have a European premium in LNG, we are going to suffer from this because we will not be at a level playing field. And they can do this in many, many ways. But I think we have to understand that we shouldn't be naive. We have to be in competition versus China. We cannot just say, well, the Chinese will contract all the gas we need and they will sell us to us when we need it. It's not going to work, and it's not the master plan of the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving on to Australia, Anne-Sophie, the market is facing domestic shortages. We've seen the government intervene into that market to try and address that shortage. So with an energy price cap introduced in December and a proposed restriction on LNG exports, would you like to comment on what's happening there?
Yeah, I think, based in Europe, we are a little bit far away of what is happening in some parts of the Asian region. And I don't think there has been that many comments about what is happening in Australia. Of course, the Chinese and the Japanese, who are very large buyers of Australian LNG, are extremely concerned. So to explain a little bit, and this is not a new situation, actually, the eastern part of Australia has been facing gas shortages for quite a long time. I cannot even remember the first time I heard about that. And this is also a region which has been planning to install import LNG terminals, which have been planned for quite a long time. This is also a region, if you are looking a little bit at the north in Gladstone, which has also 3 large LNG export plants. And the problem is that this region is facing shortages, and these shortages are becoming more and more acute. So they have designed a few years ago, it was in 2017, a so-called Australian domestic gas security mechanism, which would give the government the potential to actually limit the exports. Of course, I mean, Australia is also considered as a very reliable LNG exporter. So the government is in this very difficult position that they might now have to restrict LNG exports if there is not enough gas for the domestic market. And unlike the previous version of the security mechanism, this is going to be decided on a quarterly basis rather than an annual basis, and therefore tell the exporters, well, very sorry, but you have to restrict that. Of course, there is a little bit of margin in terms of spot LNG supply. So definitely, first of all, when you are looking at LNG exports, you are not allowing anything which is spot, but you leave the contract. But we might be in a situation where indeed, if the shortages were becoming too acute, the Australian government would have to maybe consider telling the companies, well, sorry, but there is you need to reduce LNG exports. Why is this important? This is important because we are still right now in a relatively tight global LNG market, and we need every single molecule of LNG. So last year we had the accident with Freeport LNG, which removed a very important part of LNG supply. I mean, on average, it was about 10 billion cubic meters for the whole year. And the impact of Australia has still to be assessed. It might be much lower, but the point is we need every single molecule of LNG in the world.
Okay, and so 6 months ago, concerns about rolling blackouts in Europe if it had turned out to be a very cold winter. That didn't happen, obviously, but we were having those kind of problems in Central Asia, which is an overlooked market. An overlooked crisis was happening there. Staying with you, Anne-Sophie, what can you say about that?
Yes, I think, nobody is really paying attention to that specific region. I mean, which is quite complex, I have to say. When I was working for BP and doing the statistics on that region, that was a very complicated part of the energy and the gas system. But what is happening in those, especially two countries, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and I would like to point out the blog that my colleagues Ako Schloss and Tatiana Mitrova have written about that. So we have two countries which are large gas producers. They are also exporters of natural gas to China. In both cases, I mean, especially in Kazakhstan, the gas demand has been increasing over the past decade, is continuing to increase, and they have been facing over the past winter extremely cold weather. I understand that in Tashkent, it had not been that cold for the past 50 years. So we are talking about like minus 30 degrees, temperatures that we in Europe are not even used to. And of course, you are combining very high peak winter demand because people want to have heating with relatively old infrastructure, and with the fact that at the same time, these countries are exporting to China, except that Kazakhstan has actually stopped the exports to China. So again, I mean, that could, play very well into what Thierry said about, the imperative for China to actually secure its energy. And as far as Uzbekistan is concerned, I mean, they have also been facing some very tight gas supply and demand situation. So what we have seen in 2022 is that actually the gas exports from those two countries has been declining. Usually it had been around 11, 12 billion cubic meters, but last year it was only 8 billion cubic meters, which is, still a relatively significant quantity when you are looking at the Chinese gas market. So, we have not really paid attention to that situation. That situation, especially if the exports from Central Asia to China are declining, maybe to zero, maybe to anywhere between 0 and 8 BCM, but 8 BCM seems very stretched right now, would mean that China would have to import that missing gas from somewhere else. And somewhere else, this is a global LNG market. And as Thierry mentioned, China has been buying an absolutely incredible amount of LNG over the past few years. And it would be very foolish for us to assume that, this LNG is maybe going to be resold to us like it had been during last summer. But during winter, the fiesta is over. Security of supply first, And China will keep the LNG, especially the LNG that it has contracted, and maybe go to the market if really they need additional spot LNG. But the most important thing as far as China is concerned is that they have been contracting record amounts of LNG over the past 2 years, and this is very much set to continue. We heard about another potential new record contract. There was a one with Sinopec last year, 4 million tonnes over 27 years, largest contract ever signed. And now there is potentially another one again with Qatar Energy.
Mm-hmm.
If,
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Thierry.
Yeah, if I may, I think what we have to understand is, yes, we didn't have any blackouts this winter in Europe, but the crisis is far from over. I think that's really what we should keep in mind, and what perhaps policymakers are again forgetting. I mean, the policymakers just realize, fine, we didn't have any blackouts, everything is okay, and then we can look at 2030 targets, 2050 targets. No, the crisis isn't over. We cannot assume that plants operate at 100% all over the time. That doesn't work. I mean, plants can operate at 100% for extreme when there is an extreme need for a short period of time. And Norway has done this, by the way. Norway did help us, but as Anne-Sophie mentioned, I mean, you will face some unplanned issues. You will face some issues, whatever production, transportation, you will face those issues. And we are short in gas right now. So if we want to get away from this crisis, we need to think of it in the short, medium, and long term. And again, I speak as a French, not only do we have an energy crisis in France, but we still have a nuclear crisis on top of it, where nuclear plants are not going to operate at the required level, which means that we are going to face potentially more difficult times next winter.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, if I may add, we still have a very tense situation as far as hydro is concerned. I mean, in France, at the beginning of February, we realized that we had been going for an entire month without any significant rain. So the situation has somehow improved. But I think, people are starting to realize that hydro, which, was pretty much considered as almost a given, may not be available. And the drop in hydro generation that we had last year was absolutely substantial. And this is the reason why we were continuing to use natural gas in the power generation. And it had been particularly acute in some countries which have a lot of hydro generation, usually in particular Spain, Italy, and France. So we need to be very careful. And, there are a lot of things that governments in Europe can be prepared for and that they can push forward, including developing renewable generation, improving the energy efficiency, and do more in terms of energy savings. But nuclear generation, hydro levels, and the weather, because we have been very lucky last year, are something which totally outside of the government's control. So we have to keep in mind that right now the situation may look very reassuring. The prices have come down, they still remain high. But as Fatih Birol mentioned, earlier this year, we are not out of the woods yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I want to keep on Europe, but first I just want to circle back to Central Asia. So, yeah, both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan facing gas shortages, and at the height of their problems with that, there were talks with Moscow about Moscow supplying extra gas to those countries. Can you envisage? Obviously, Russia is looking for new outlets for its gas, which it can't put onto the European or isn't putting onto the European market right now. Can you envisage Russia supplying more gas to Central Asia, and then those Central Asian countries in turn being able to bump up supply or at least maintain supply to China? Anne-Sophie.
I mean, yeah, when Russia first made this proposal, I think it was before the winter became extremely cold. So it was, I understand, politely refused by both countries. But now that they have been facing this very acute crisis, Russia came back again. And of course, there was a question also about taking over some of the network operations. So, which was not particularly something that both governments in Central Asia were keen to see happening. So I understand that this requirement has been dropped. But yes, it could be a possibility. We need to be very much aware that Russia is looking for other outlets for its gas. Central Asia could be one. I mean, you need to be realistic about what you can do. And there is an existing network with Central Asia, at least. There is no pipeline, no existing pipeline between the traditional producing regions in Russia and China. The gas which is currently being exported is a gas which is produced in the eastern part of Russia. It has nothing to do with those fields which were traditionally supplying Europe and which now, of course, are producing much less.
Mhm.
I think we have to keep in mind that Gazprom production went down by 100 BCM last year. And so, I mean, it's 20%. So they need to find other ways. It needs to find other export markets. It's cheap gas. There will be a question about infrastructure. There will be a question about price. But remember, the cost of this gas is very cheap, and it's nearly a sunk cost as it is right now.
Mhm. Okay, so back to Europe. What EU regulatory movements are you both keeping an eye on right now? Thierry, let's start with you.
Yes, perhaps another element on the crisis in Europe. I mean, it's
Sure.
the right time to have this podcast. Remember, we are closing some nuclear plants in Germany in the coming days, which means that we are going to tighten the system again and again and again. So I think that's really where we have to be realistic. And I think the dogmatic approach in Brussels should be challenged, and we should look at a much more pragmatic element. So that, I think, is the first element. And again, stop being naive vis-à-vis China. They won't provide us the gas we need if they need it themselves. What I'm looking right now at is the electricity market, because I think what we have is extreme high electricity prices. I disagree with the Commission when the Commission says it's the fact that the war in Ukraine pushed gas prices up and so therefore pushed the electricity price up. Yes, it's true, but it's only half of the equation. I believe that the other half of the equation, which again, what Anne-Sophie mentioned is very important. What can government do? And the other half of the equation is what I call greenflation. I mean, if you just think that between 2018 and 2023, the price of CO2 was multiplied by 10, the cost of pollution of electricity from a coal-fired power plant, which we use and we continue to use at the European level in Germany and Poland often, was €9 per megawatt hour back in 2018. It's now €90 per megawatt hour, which means that the price of electricity will stay high for European citizens. And so therefore, redesigning the electricity market is a must. I think it should have been done with the Green Deal. I think this is a consequence of the Green Deal, green inflation. And I think this is where we have to look at. And I think this commission has little time left to do this. And the next commission may face a European Parliament that will be perhaps less pro-European. So if we want to find something that is European-wide, we need to think of it right now. And it cannot just be small changes. I think we have to look at, and I'm very much in favor of the Greek proposal, to look at the difference between the balancing electrons and the non-balancing electrons, and to say that in a commodity market, you trade the balancing stuff, not the non-balancing stuff. And so therefore, nuclear, a renewable that has a priority injection on the grid should be treated differently, should be at cost plus, and the one should be at a market price. Again, if you say this, you're not going to be very popular with the renewable industry. But at the end of the day, where do we want to be popular? Do we want to be popular with the lobby, or do we want to be popular as a policymaker with citizens that have the right to vote? That, I think, is the interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Anne-Sophie?
I think, it's worth first looking back at what happened in 2022 and compare what has happened with the Repower EU objectives. So you may remember that when the first document was published in March and then subsequently in May, the second version, there were a certain number of objectives for 2022. So increase by 50 billion cubic meters of LNG has been achieved, to my greater surprise, but that was also partially thanks to China. Increase in terms of pipeline supplies has been also achieved, thanks in particular to Norway, but that's something that we can also say. Increase in terms of biomethane production, no, not quite, but I think it takes time to increase that. In terms of the energy savings, we have also managed to achieve that. Although I have to say a little bit of that is also due to industrial gas demand destruction, but there has been a real effort in the residential sector also, partially helped by mild weather, but still I think people have understood also, maybe because they were paying a much higher prices, that you need to reduce your consumption. Where I think we have been failing a little bit short, but again, this is something that we need to work upon, is in terms of the renewable deployment. We are still facing all these issues, and we absolutely need, and I think the European Commission and the government definitely understand that we need to deploy that much faster, especially if we want to reach those very ambitious 2030 objectives. So, I think every year we need to see where we are and where we stand compared to the 2030 targets and understand what needs to be improved. Now, on all the measures that have been, set in place by the European Commission as well as the government. Well, first, the price cap that was decided at the end of December last year has been particularly well put in place because, in fact, the gas prices have started to decline pretty much at that time. However, this is now a feature of the market which is present. So I think we need to understand in the long run whether this is going to affect the way that people are trading and basically covering themselves. Also, I hear more and more about potentially restricting or banning Russian LNG because we still have Russian LNG coming to the market, going to the European market and to the European countries right now. There could be different outcomes, as I've recently written about that, if we ban Russian LNG. You could imagine that there would be a perfect swap, that we will send this Russian LNG to any other country in Asia and that we would get oversupplies in return. That would be if we are very lucky. There could be also a situation where the market is actually tightening and you say goodbye to those Russian LNG supplies. However, they are not coming back towards Europe. So we will be left with much lower LNG supplies than anticipated. And of course, there is always a possibility, as it happened in 2022, that Mr. Putin is going to retaliate if we are putting any additional measure restricting the flows of Russian LNG or Russian pipeline gas. Granted, this is still a threat which is upon us, whether we are taking any additional measure on Russia or not. Putin can decide to do whatever he wants. He doesn't care, actually, given where he is now. So, my point is, before we act, we need to really prepare. And this goes back to our reflections on the fact that the gas market is still very tight. We are not out of the woods yet. We need to be extremely proactive in terms of continuing to reduce the demand. And I think this is exactly why the European Commission decided to extend the 15% gas demand reduction a couple of weeks ago. And we need also to be extremely proactive in terms of securing LNG and natural gas in a very tight market. Now, there is this new energy platform, which is, going to start. Let's see, how successful this is. But we need to be very realistic about the fact that the situation right now is better than it was last year, but it's still extremely tight.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
If I can add two things, thanks, Anne-Sophie. I think what we have to keep in mind in terms of order of magnitude is that we are receiving Russian pipe gas from Gazprom and Russian LNG. And if you add the two together, it's something like a bit more than 10% of our demand as we speak. So 10% is important in a very tight market. So that's the first element I wanted to share. The second element, I really like, Anne-Sophie, how you stated we have to look at what we've achieved in 2022. And I'll add one element, if you allow me, Anne-Sophie. It's on the CO2, because at the end of the day, what matters is the CO2 emission. And CO2 emission might be reduced. We'll see what the data are. But if you look at CO2 for power generation, because we've replaced the nuclear by coal, it has increased. That's a problem. That's a problem. We are not going in the right direction in power generation. That's, I think, is really a failure of the European Commission, and in particular, in this case, the French and the Germans.
And in particular, we have been reducing our CO2 emissions also because of reduced industrial activity. I mean, I still think, we might see eventually some effects or some impact in the long term. But for the moment, we need to be realistic about what has actually happened. And I totally agree with Thierry on the fact that power generation, it's not a happy picture. Absolutely not. It's a very worrying picture, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thierry, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think I would like to do my closing remark on the 2030 renewable target. I think we are way too much dogmatic here. And again, I think what Anne-Sophie stated, I think policymakers should be liable of what they are doing right now. And I think right now the picture is bleak. The picture is bleak. We are still in an energy crisis. The climate crisis hasn't been solved. And as Anne-Sophie stated, perhaps the CO2 reductions that we've seen outside the power generation may be just because of deindustrialization, which is going to be a very bleak picture. So I think we cannot continue to just say, well, things are okay right now. We don't look exactly at the results, but it's going to be much, much brighter, much, much better in 2030, in 2040, in 2050. And I think we are very naive here. I think we need to address the energy and the climate crisis as emergency crisis, and we need to do this in a step-by-step pragmatic approach. Just to give you one element, because I think it's important. If we had, again, it's completely theoretical, if we had taken completely the coal out of our power generation and replace it by gas, we will have reduced our emission in the power sector by nearly 40%. And you can say this looks very strange. Well, this is exactly what the UK had done in 2016 to 2019. So again, I think we need to be pragmatic. I think we need to look at this step by step, not 2040, not 2050 targets.
Well, thank you both once more for your time, and thank you to all viewers and listeners. So this has been NGW's In a Nutshell podcast, which takes stock of the most important developments shaping the global gas industry. Thank you, and see you next time.